Hey, it's Rebecca. Welcome. We have been getting several questions, actually popped up last night about altitude sickness and altitude sickness as it pertains to some of the adventures that we're going on this year. So, this year we are going on big adventures that are going to be high altitude areas. We are climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. So, the summit of Kilimanjaro is just over 19,000 feet. We're also doing the Salcantay Trail in Peru, and that trail, the highest point is just over 15,000 feet. So if you don't live in a high altitude place, those elevations can be rather intimidating. And so what I want to do today is just take just a few minutes to talk to you about what we're doing here at Hike Like a Woman to help prevent altitude sickness on these trips. So altitude sickness for me, or acute mountain sickness, altitude sickness, mild altitude sickness, because it can get really dangerous. But for me, like mild altitude sickness usually happens just over 14,000 feet. And the way that I kind of feel when I get altitude sickness is I feel a little bit like I'm hungover. So I have a little bit of a headache, feel a little queasy in my stomach. I feel super tired and I'm really grumpy and irritable. And that's how I feel when I get altitude sickness. And we are going to be at high altitude areas. And so I think when you join us for a trip to one of these high altitude areas, the best thing we can do is just know how to be prepared in the event that we do start to feel kind of icky because of the altitude. So here's kind of some things that we have put in place here at Hike Like a Woman to help out with altitude sickness. I call it the Hike Like a Woman altitude prevention plan, but the best way to prevent altitude sickness is just not to go on adventures, and that's so sad. So one thing that we're doing here is I'm doing a really careful job of vetting the guiding companies that we are using on these trips. And I think by using guiding companies and guides that have a good reputation in the outdoor industry and that are very knowledgeable, that actually is one of those safety measures in place that we can use to help prevent altitude sickness, because the guides that we're using are so used to guiding people like us up these big mountains that they know how to prevent altitude sickness. So with what they're feeding us, with what we're drinking, and all of those things. So that's the first step, is making sure that we're going with good companies with really smart, experienced, and educated guides. And we are. The other thing that I think is important that is often overlooked when it comes to planning a high altitude adventure is making sure that there's a little bit of training and physical fitness that goes into preparing for the trek. And, there's a lot of people say that your physical fitness doesn't really affect whether or not you'll get altitude sickness. And there's a lot of really elite athletes that travel to high altitude places and do get very sick with altitude sickness. So I don't know that that's necessarily like an indicator of whether or not you're going to get altitude sickness. But I've found when I've traveled to high elevation places, if I'm not as physically fit, then I tend to get knocked on my ass a little bit more from altitude sickness. And maybe that's a mental thing. Maybe it's like a placebo effect, but I think it's important to train before going on a trek to a high altitude place. And I have a training plan ready for those who are going to Kilimanjaro. Already have that training plan, and most are following it or some variation of it. And for the Peru trip, if you're going to Peru with us, I'll make sure that you get a copy of that training plan so you can start to prepare yourself for that trek. Another thing that I'm doing personally is I've never used the prescription drug Diamox or Diamox. I'm not sure how you say it, but this is a prescription drug that helps prevent the symptoms of altitude sickness. I haven't used it, but I am going to get a prescription for it. I've already talked to my physician to make sure that it doesn't that it won't cause any adverse side effects with some cancer medications that I'm still on. But I'm going to get a prescription for this medication. I have guided women here in our local mountain range where, we've gotten a little bit above 10,000 feet who have taken Diamox on our backpacking trips and have not had an ounce of altitude sickness. So I've seen that medication work. And so I'm going to try it out on Kilimanjaro and maybe I'll use it in Peru. I'm not sure. But I am going to have that in my kit available. Another thing that I'm doing to help prevent altitude sickness is I am going to fly in a few days early to Acclimate. So I'm flying in a few days to Kilimanjaro, not necessarily to Acclimate because I live at a pretty high elevation here in southeastern Wyoming, but I am going to be flying into Peru, into Cusco, Peru, a few days before our trip starts. So I think I'm going to fly in on like October 1st. I think the trip officially starts on the 3rd. I want to give myself 48 to 72 hours where I can just hang out, lay low, drink a lot of water, eat some good food, get some electrolytes in my system, and rest. So I'm flying in a few days early to Acclimate to do all of those things, hydration, healthy food, not drinking alcohol, getting electrolytes in your system, and prioritizing rest are really important things to do to prevent altitude sickness or to reduce the symptoms of altitude sickness. And when we're on these trails, I was looking at the elevation gain here on both of our Kilimanjaro trek and our SALCANTAY trek. And our guides have put together really good plans where we're going to be climbing higher during the day and sleeping lower at night. And that's really important part of acclimating is to climb high, sleep low. There's also plans in place. So if we're climbing and you're not feeling really good, the best thing to do is actually to get to a lower elevation. And so as we're climbing, if there's plans in place to evacuate anyone who's feeling altitude sickness down to a lower trail, a lower campsite, and that's part of making sure that we're using these good guiding companies. There's a few other things that we're doing that I'm going to try that I haven't ever tried, but in Peru, I've heard a ton of people talking about coca leaves and coca tea and muna tea. I'm not even sure if I said that correctly, but coca tea and coca leaves, it's a stimulant and it really helps prevent altitude sickness. And I've heard that if you start to get altitude sickness in Peru, guides will just like grab some leaves and ask you to eat them or encourage you to eat them. And this muna tea that I'm really interested in trying is a tea that kind of helps with the upset stomach, the queasiness, a little bit of nausea that sometimes can occur at altitude sickness. And I've heard that most hotels in Peru just have this tea available for tourists because I think that they know that a lot of us are coming from low elevation places. So it will be interesting to play around with those kind of natural remedies for altitude sickness and see if they work. We're also having porters. So on both of these treks, we are going to have porters who are going to be carrying things like our sleeping bags and our food. And we're just going to be carrying a light day pack. And we're paying a little bit more for the trips so that we can have that assistance. But I think when it comes to days like when we're climbing all the way up to 15,000 feet from 11,000 feet, it's going to be nice to have porters. And of course, we are using guiding companies that make sure they compensate their guides and porters properly and well. And we will tip our porters generously because they're providing a service so that we can go on these magnificent adventures. In Africa, when we climb Kilimanjaro, there's a saying, pole pole, that the guides and porters will say all the time, and it just really means like slowly. And it's never a race here at Hike Like a Woman. Like, let's be honest. But making sure that we are hiking at a pace that is comfortable. I call it level 1 training or zone 1 training, where you can carry on a conversation, you can sing a song. That's the pace that we're going to be walking out, with lots of stops for snacks, for photos, because we are going to some of the most beautiful places in the world. So we are going to be hiking very, very slowly. We won't leave anyone behind. And finally, we will have canned oxygen. So I know on Kilimanjaro, our guides will have oxygen available if there is a medical emergency or an extreme situation when someone does need canned oxygen. And I think in Peru, you can buy the little canned oxygen that you can take a couple huffs and see if that helps. When I owned an outdoor retail store, we sold a ton of canned oxygen, and I know that a lot of people found it very beneficial. So I'll probably buy some canned oxygen, and I think our guides and porters will have some as well. So that is what we are doing here at Hike Like a Woman as an organization to make sure that we can be healthy on our trips, that we can reach our goals, right, and do our best, and also have fun, because if we're just suffering, we're not going to have fun. So that's the plan that we have in place right now. If you have any questions about our upcoming trips, or if you want to reach out to me, you can find me over at Hike Like a Woman. You can DM me on Instagram or Facebook. You can also send an email over to hikelikeawoman@gmail.com, and someone from my team will forward that message on to me. But if you have any more questions about our trips, anything I can do to help you feel confident in the outdoors, to help you be safe in the outdoors, I'm here for you. So, and of course, if you want to book those trips, our Kilimanjaro trip is full. We have 13 on the wait list, but we are going to climb Kilimanjaro again in 2025. So there's time to save your money, and there's time to prepare physically and mentally for that climb in the summer of 2025. We still have open spots for our trip to Peru in October. It's going to be amazing. I'm looking forward to both of those trips, plus all the other trips that we have going on, Costa Rica, Alaska, Yellowstone. They're all going to be fantastic. So questions, hit me up on social media, send an email over, and I hope to see you on one of our big adventures.